Hi guys! I can't believe your exam is in 2 days, and I bet you can't believe it either. Today in New York City, where I am, it's Sunday, May 19th, and your exam is on Tuesday, the 21st. So, someone had asked to go over some of the stuff from topic 2. And I'm going to link the more in-depth videos that I've done for topic 2 in the comments of this because it is like a pretty big section of the syllabus. But for your last minute study guide, I wanted to give you 5 things that I think are really important to have as a general takeaway from that topic. So let's get started. The first thing you should definitely know how to do when it comes to topic 2 is how to state examples. And the IB syllabus is really specific about having you state examples in as much detail as you can possibly provide. So there are some questions where if you answer them with a general animal name and don't give a specific species, the IB board won't give you the point. So I've given here 3 examples of things they might ask for that are good known named examples to just kind of have in your pocket. One is an example of an invasive species. The example that I love for this is Burmese pythons in the Florida Everglades. If you haven't studied that case study in your class, you can look it up. Burmese pythons that people kept as pets were released into the Florida Everglades in the 70s and 80s, and they've totally taken over the ecosystem. So it's a good example of an invasive species that takes over all the resources that are there for the natural food chain and really like disrupts what's happening. An example of succession, and specifically secondary succession, which we'll go over in a little bit more detail later in this video, is Mount St. Helens in the United States. Mount St. Helens had a major eruption in the 80s or the 90s, I can't remember. But it's a really good example of everything being buried in volcanic ash, and then the succession place starting not from a point of like a bare surface, but from a really covered that there was an ecosystem there, but it was undercover. So that's a good example of secondary succession. And the reason I'm giving you an example for secondary succession is primary succession really only takes place when nothing has colonized an area before. So primary succession, the example would be like when life began on Earth. And then a couple good examples of zonation. One is up an alpine gradient like Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania. And another is on a coastline. There are good examples of zonation. So the example I have here is the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. So anytime that you're asked to provide an example, just remember to give a specific name, and that will help you get as many points as possible from those questions. The next thing I want to go over is abiotic factors. Topic 2 talks about both biotic and abiotic factors. Abiotic factors are non-living things, and they're really important because they decide the amount of life that can survive in a given area. The most important factors, and this comes up sometimes, are the amount of sunlight and the amount of rain or water that are available in a given ecosystem. And that's important because those 2 factors decide the productivity of that ecosystem. And that's what we're going to go over next is productivity. So when I say productivity, what I mean is the conversion of energy to biomass. That how much an area is able to do that is referred to as its productivity. And there are 2 kinds of productivity that we talk about in ecology. The first is primary productivity, and that's the productivity undergone by plants. And the other is secondary productivity, and that is the productivity undergone by animals. You can also talk about gross and net productivity. Basically, gross productivity is the total amount of energy that an organism takes in, and net productivity is the amount of energy that it has left over after it takes care of its respiratory needs. So remember, respiration is like, in this case, not just breathing, but anything that an organism has to do to stay alive. And the amount of energy that an organism needs in order to stay alive, changes as it gets bigger, which is why organisms don't have leftover energy to just grow and grow and grow for their whole lives. As an organism, a plant or animal gets bigger, it uses up more of the energy it takes in just to take care of its respiratory needs, if that makes sense. And that's actually something we'll look at a little bit in the next slide in the process of succession. So, succession in an ecosystem is how that ecosystem changes over time. Zonation is how an ecosystem changes over an ecological gradient. And that's just sort of a basic definition that you should know. A lot of times, the IB exams for environmental systems and societies will go a little bit in depth on some part of succession. So you should be familiar with the stages of succession. Sometimes this comes up like in a long response question, starting off with colonization and primary succession. That's when organisms blow in or are transferred in somehow to a totally barren landscape. Establishment, when soil starts to be created and things start to grow. Competition, when a lot of different organisms are trying to fight to survive in a given environment. And then stabilization, when some of those organisms get outcompeted and the things that are going to be successful in the given environment really establish themselves there. Climax community is definitely a term that you should use in any conversation about the stages of succession, and that's when a given environment is stable and self-perpetuating. So it can just exist on its own with what it has inside of it. And there are some changes that occur during these different stages of succession. The size of the organisms gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then eventually levels off. The complexity of energy flow gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually levels off. Soil depth gets bigger and bigger and bigger and eventually levels off. And both biodiversity and productivity go up to a point and then sort of dip down a little bit before they level off. So sometimes that comes up as, give a named example and talk about the stages of succession that have occurred in an ecosystem. So you could talk about like secondary succession on Mount St. Helens and talk about all those things. And the last thing that we're going to go over in this sort of like a quick fire review video is R and K selected species, because those do come up sometimes in describing the stages of succession. R selected species are common at the beginning stages of succession. They're small organisms that live a short life. They have a ton of kids and they're not very good parents. They just sort of like see what survives. If you look at a population growth curve, the R area, the growth rate area of the chart, is this place of exponential growth. So that's where those organisms get their name, is they like have exponential growth. K-selected species are named for being up here at the carrying capacity line of a population growth curve. So K-selected species come later in the process of succession. They're bigger, they live a longer life, they have few offspring, but their offspring are big, and they're good parents. K-selected species are thoughtful about raising their children, and a lot of their children are raised all the way into adulthood. And some examples of K-selected species are oak trees and African lions. R-selected species, American rabbit, wood mice, and flower beetles. Notice I'm giving specific names to all of those organisms. I'm not just saying trees and lions and bunnies. I'm really giving as much of a scientific name as I can. That will serve you well in your exam. That's all that we're going to go over for topic 2. I feel like those 5 things are some easy points that you can get if you understand those general ideas of the topic. But definitely go through and look at my other topic 2 videos if you have time, because there is a lot more information in this section of the syllabus. And as always, if you want to check out my LearnSys course and do some extra practice tests, I'll put the link for that in the description of this video as well. Good luck with your studies. I can hopefully do one more of these videos tomorrow. If there's anything people are dying to go over, let me know in the comments. And Get a lot of sleep and drink a lot of water and keep killing it on your IB tests. I'll see you soon. Bye.